When you ask what Carl's like, he's smart.
Extremely honest, he's
very, very thorough.
He's impulsive. He's enthusiastic.
He is the most unique person I think I've ever met.
He bets on people.
24 years ago, Carl Berg changed my life.
I had never met a guy that I thought worked as hard as I did, or was as driven as I was to get ahead until I met Carl.
Carl moves at an extremely fast pace.
But he's always been fair. But somebody gets outside the fairness box, and then good luck.
Carl decides to slam my head in the overhead compartment. I start to black out.
That's the difference with him compared to a lot of people. They won't throw down. He'll throw down.
And he doesn't give up.
If it wasn't for him, I probably would have never made a deal. And if it wasn't for me, he would have gone broke.
He has a passion for knowledge and a passion for helping people out.
If you can't get money from me, then you better go get a job, because you sure won't get it from anyone else.
And he's a very generous man. Most people have no idea how much he does for his friends and for organizations that he feels strongly about.
And when he signed the lease and we shake hands and he says, "Walter, now you're my customer. If you have any problems, any questions, call me." And I was extremely happy when he said that.
He usually wins. One way or another, he wins. And it might not always be money, but it is the camaraderie of the guys or the people, or who he touches. He's kind of infectious.
The paradox of Carl Berg. While he's been so successful, he's not afraid to roll up his sleeves and really understand a problem. And he never ceases to amaze me.
Well, I was born in 1937 in Canyon City, Colorado. About a year and a half after that, my dad got a construction job at Conchas Dam. After about a year and a half, we moved to Tucumcari. And we first lived in a small one-bedroom, one-bath duplex. And that was about the time my brother was born. And it was either 45 or 46. We came to California for that summer for vacation. When we got to California, I remember that we went to Golden Gate Park. And the other thing that I remember is that was right after, sometime right after World War II had ended. And my dad had to borrow gas stamps from all of our friends so that we could make the trip. The worst thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life was the death of my father in 1948. Soon after that, my mother, who had been a teacher before they got married but had been a housewife, went back to teaching, and we moved to a different house in Tucumcari, where my mother lived until the day she died, this past year at 97. Tucumcari was a town of about 6,000 people, was a major connection for the railroad, the Southern Pacific and the Union Pacific. And so that was what most of the people did, that or farming. And it was on Route 66. I think my first real job was working in a service station. That was where I first got into selling, was every tourist that came by, you tried to sell them a water bag and a fan belt. I don't know what they could have done with the fan belt if they ever needed it, but we made sure they had a spare. Then after that, my next job was being a pin setter in the bowling alley. Now, most of the people here tonight didn't ever know that there were people that had to set the pins. So in those days, they didn't have electric pin setters. So you would stand back there kind of out of the way when the ball came down, and then you would put all the pins in the thing and push it down. And if you were really good, you could do 2 alleys. And then one of the guys who was bowling all the time, he offered me a job. He had the Dr. Pepper bottling company in Tucumcari. And Dr. Pepper wasn't exactly one of the greatest sellers at that time. I would get in my little Dr. Pepper truck and go trying to sell Dr. Pepper to everybody in Tucumcari. When I got through, I really had sold every single store in Tucumcari. The few holdouts finally bought something from me so they could say the next time I went back, we already have some. In our high school, Dr. Pepper outsold Coca-Cola 36 cases to 1 because I was so big on Dr. Pepper, I would almost force everybody to drink Dr. Pepper. I was offered a job to work in a motel, one of the local motels on Highway 66. So that summer, I worked all summer in the motel, and I worked the following summer in the motel. So that gave me the experience I needed when I went to college. I went to the University of New Mexico. It was a relatively small school then, and the only thing you needed to get in was they had a rope near the front door, and if you could find the rope and guide your way into the front door, you qualified. That's probably the only way I got in. Got another job as night clerk in the nicest motel in town, and that was in downtown Albuquerque. And my whole purpose in that was I wanted to become an investment banker. And in those days, to be an investment banker, you needed a connection. And so I figured somebody would check into the motel, I'd get to know them, and that'd be my connection. Finally, in my junior year, there was this guy came in and registered his Hughes Investment Company. And I thought he was in the brokerage business. And he stayed there quite often. So I figured, well, this is my chance to get to know this guy. And I'll try and get him to be my connection to get into Wall Street. Well, it turned out my plan worked perfectly. But when I got to know him, I found out that he wasn't in the investment banking business, but he was the largest home builder in the United States. He had 100 corporations from his own timber mills straight through the savings and loans banks, a mortgage company, a title company, a lumber company, a paint store, you name it, anything to do with home building he had. He offered me a job midway through my junior year at his mortgage company in Albuquerque. And so I worked there the rest of my junior year and my senior year. And at that time, I was always complaining about the way they ran the home office in Fort Worth. So he told me, okay, Berg, if you think you can do better, when you graduate, you can come to Fort Worth and run the mortgage company. Well, this is the third largest mortgage company in the United States at that time. And so, I knew a little bit about how you processed mortgages, but didn't know very much about how you ran a mortgage company. So this was quite an interesting experience. When I got there, I replaced the son-in-law of the president of Fort Worth National Bank, who they had hired because he couldn't get a job anywhere else. And it was a total disaster. Half of the payments on our mortgages weren't being paid. And when I looked into it, I found 12,000 letters that had never been responded to. And so all of these people, they'd send in letters. When nobody answered them, they'd just get frustrated and quit making their payments. And so basically, I got a few of the letters out and started looking at them and noticed that 80% of the questions were kind of the same. So I had the secretaries go sort the letters by 25 different items. And then we just went through and checked all the check blocks on the letter to answer their questions. And that solved 98% of the payments. We sent those letters out and all the people started making their payments again. But the most important thing about this opportunity was because of the position that I happened to be in and my relationship with him, I was able to learn everything about this company. And so about that time after I'd been there about a year and a half to 2 years, we had the first recession since World War II. So we had 125 companies or 100 companies, whatever it was, losing money at the same time. And basically, all of these people had never made a decision in their life. So I basically told him, I said, look, if you want to pay these people, that's perfectly okay. But you got to get rid of them because they can't make a decision. And so he said, why don't you come up with a plan? And if I like the plan, I'll execute it. I came up with the plan for him. He just couldn't do it. He told me he liked the plan, but he couldn't execute it. So I waited about 3 or 4 months and just told him, look, you're going to go bankrupt. And I don't want the first job that I'm involved in to be a bankruptcy. So I quit and I went to work for he had a 32-year-old partner from El Paso, Texas, who was a big playboy, He had 7 kids, lived in the nicest house that I've ever seen to this date. And I was like a son. I lived at his house. I worked for him. His company did apartments, retail, commercial, and housing. And there weren't that many employees because everything was subbed out. So basically I was involved in everything they did for about 2 years and learned another enormous part about all the different phases of the construction industry and everything you could do. We formed the first SBIC at that time. I probably was there about 2 years. One day we got in a big fight. I don't even remember over what. And he says, if you're so smart, how come I'm worth 60 million and you're worth nothing? And I said, I'm stupid enough to be working for you. And I got in my Corvair and headed to California. I started going to visit mortgage companies. And I couldn't tell them really what I did because nobody would believe it. So I just said, I can do anything in a mortgage company. And I don't care how much you pay me, because if I don't like what I'm getting paid or I don't like what I'm doing, I'm going to quit in 6 months anyway, so it doesn't matter. I finally got a job at a small mortgage company in Sunnyvale.
Carl Berg called on me and said, I can service your FHA and GI buyers. And that is a very time-consuming process back then. It used to take 2 or 3 months to get the loans approved, and Carl had it down to a great system, and he just did a terrific job for us. And I had never met a guy that I thought worked as hard as I did or was as driven as I was to get ahead until I met Carl. So after a couple of years of handling our loans, he wanted to buy he felt he deserved a promotional or part interest in the William Stanwell Company, which was the company that was actually his employer. And the Stanwell Company didn't want to give Carl any of the equity. So he was complaining to me. I said, why don't you come to work for us? You'll make twice as much and work a lot less.
Well, I'd learned one thing from being in the mortgage business. If people can see that you're worried about closing a deal over money, they can spot it immediately when you're selling something. So I called a friend of mine in Tucumcari and said, would you loan me $1,000 a month for 12 months so that I won't have to worry about whether I make a sale or not? And if I can't do it in 12 months, then I'll forget the sales business. Well, it turned out I sold 5 houses the first month, so I didn't ever have to borrow anything, and I kept selling a lot of houses. John and I, we had our desk facing each other at Midtown Realty, and he and I would fight it out every year for the #1 salesman in Santa Clara County. And I'm sorry to say most of the time John won, but I think I maybe beat him once or twice. But it was a competition. There was no competition except he and I fighting each other. And we would do anything to beat the other guy.
All the other salespeople would wait for the multiple listings to come through the mail. And this is before the brokers had books. Now they have these computerized books. In those days we had loose leaf listings that come through the mail. As I'd go down to the multiple listing office the day before they were due in the mail, figuring that the secretary would be mailing them, and I'd pick up mine there, and I'd get kind of a head start on the rest of the brokerage community by going through the listings, picking out the ones that are really interesting that I had clients to, that I could get my clients out to before it even hit the main market. Okay, well, Carl learned that trick real quick, and so we were used to race around to the multiple listing offices to get the listings first.
During that same time, I probably almost lived at Sobrato's house. I was probably there for dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. Sobrato's really had never liked anyone that I was going out with too much. And then in 1966, I met Mary Ann. So I called her up and asked her if she'd like to go out for a drink. I wasn't about to buy dinner until I'd met her. And so she wasn't too happy about a guy that called her up for dinner. But anyway, we hit it off okay, and so Sobratos would always, since they really liked Mary Ann, they would always try and find a way to get us back together. And so finally I asked her to marry me, and she said, well, I'm planning a trip to Europe, and I'll tell you when I get back. She'd gotten all of her money out of her savings account to go on this trip in case there was an emergency. So I said, I already know the answer. If you come back with no money, you'll marry me. We got married in 1969 in San Francisco, and I had a reception at the Fairmont. And so one of the key events in my life was I was working a Sunday, and this guy came in, and he was from Belgium. And he said, I've got $300,000 to invest, and I want to do it with somebody that can invest with me. And I said, well, I don't have any money, but I'll be happy to throw in my commission, and you give me a second deed of trust for the rest of my share. And back in those days, you could easily get an 80% loan, occasionally a 90% loan.
And he said, all right, go buy it. And they basically became partners. In those days, you could buy a house in Palo Alto for $25,000, for example. Carl ended up with 30 or 40 houses, which when he sold them, I think he sold them for an average of about $700,000, $800,000 each. I mean, it's just remarkable what happened to the prices.
That was really what gave me the money to basically go into commercial real estate.